Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this fourth in our EQE preparation seminar series. My name is Guy Warner, and I'm joined today by Kirsty Dolphin from Venner Shipley. Kirsty's very kindly agreed to join and share her experiences of paper D. This is our fourth of this seminar series. So if you have joined us already, or if you want to catch up on proceedings, we've had an introductory seminar in this series that looked at the changes to the European qualifying exams that are taking place. We looked at what it means for the new papers, the foundation, which will be taking place in the next cycle of the exams, so in 2025. We spoke about M1 and M2 that will launch in 2026, and M3 and M4 that will launch the year after that. That was the first seminar series. It also spoke about the transitions and the fact that we're still under the old exams. And then we did a seminar on papers A and B. And then we also did another seminar on paper C with one of Kirsty's colleagues, Hannah, last week. So we've covered off the changes to the exams and the way these existing exams are still going to roll. We looked at papers A and B. We looked at paper C. And today we're looking at the last of the old papers, and that is paper D, the legal paper. As I say, very grateful that Kirsty is joining us today to share her experience and wisdom. On a personal note, Kirsty and I studied for the EQE exams together, and I don't think you could be in any better hands for getting advice and support for passing these exams than with Kirsty. So what we're going to do today is I'll just quickly take you through the expectations of paper D. So the fundamentals of what you need to understand in order to begin your preparation journey for this paper. It's the same structure as we did for papers A and B and paper C. But it's really important to have this grounding. Some of you on the call may be experienced in the EQEs. Some of you may just be starting your journey. It's important that we have a good grounding and understanding of where we need to be in order to give ourselves the best opportunity to start our preparations and pass the exams. So the first thing you need to know is when the exam is taking place. So paper D is the first of the exams that will take place in the cycle, followed by A, then B, then C. And then for those people that are taking F, probably nobody on this call today, that will be at the end of the series. So, but paper D, Tuesday, the 11th of March, 2025, as per the announcement linked to here. Nevertheless, make sure you check that information yourself. It never changes, but it could change this year. So make sure you make sure you stay abreast of all these pieces of information and ensure you know when the exam is taking place. The other thing that's absolutely vital is you should have enrolled for the exam. So enrollment for the exams opened on the 8th of July, and it closes towards the end of September, which is a very large window for you to enroll for these exams, but the window closes long before the exams take place. So, as I've said on the other seminars, there's only one thing that you do as a consequence of talking to or listening to us today. It's make sure you're enrolled for these exams as soon as possible. And it's one thing, the most important thing on your preparation checklist. So as you may know, should know, paper D is the legal paper. A is drafting, B is amendment, paper C is opposition, paper D, which takes place first in the cycle, is the legal paper. And as set out in the regulations, which is your primary source of truth for how to make sure you pass these exams, the purpose of this paper is to assess your ability to answer legal questions and to draft legal assessments for the benefit of your clients. The exam will last for 6 hours, and I'll talk about the structure of that in a slide in a moment. You are not expected to be verbose in your answers, and Kirsty will talk to you about how this really operates. You need to be brief, you need to be to the point, and you must cite the article, rule, and other legal basis in your answers. And again, there is a technique and a structure for how you put that information down in a hierarchy that Kirsty will talk to you about. later on in this session. So you've got questions relating to your legal knowledge, but it will also have a more complex element to it, and that's an inquiry from a notional client that needs you to give a legal opinion. And in that legal opinion, you are expected to explain the legal consequences of the situation that's been described, and it will be a complex intellectual property matter. And it can involve lots of different issues as listed here: patentability, rights of inventors, inventors of property, third-party rights, all of these things. It linked to Articles 52 to 89 of the EPC and all the corresponding articles of the PCT and community patents and the Paris Convention and all the relevant laws of the contracting state, but it's not even limited to those as well. So what that means is that paper D is a very broad paper in terms of the legal knowledge that you're expected to know about. So here we are in July, end of July 2024. You need to be really ready to plan your preparation and revision that takes you through learning the law and then being able to execute the law in order to answer the papers for paper D, questions for paper D. That's the fundamentals of it. In terms of its structure, this is the information about last year's exams. So about paper D that took place March 2024. You'll notice where the blue arrow on the left indicates this information was published pretty much at this time last year about the 2024 papers. I checked just before we went live. They haven't published equivalent information about the 2025 exams, but that's the website at the top of this page. Keep an eye on it because no doubt the schedules will be coming out very soon. So the schedules for 2025 will tell you exactly what's happening, but we can rely on last year as a good example of the structure, and it won't change very much for you. So what you can see is that as with paper C that we spoke about on last week, Friday last week, paper D is also split into parts. Paper D is split into 3 parts. Each of those parts needs to be completed before you move on to the next one, but it's not as complicated as paper C, where information from the first part was relevant to the second part. They're kind of standalone parts for this paper, but of course you need to complete them. If you don't complete D1 part 1 before the break, you can't go back to it. So you need to make sure you're really strict with your time management as you answer the papers. You can see that last year, well, the last cycle of exams in March this year, we had 3 parts. Part 1 and part 2 are about D1, the short legal questions, and the marks were split into 26 for part 1 and 29 for part 2. They were about an hour and a half long each, with a 30-minute and then a 45-minute break in between the two. And then part D2, which is the more complex legal questions, was worth 45 points and was about 2 hours, 40 minutes long. During that final part, paper D, you can take unscheduled breaks, but as with all of the online exams, make sure you're adhering to all of the online invigilation criteria. No documents are available for printing in this paper, and no calendars will be provided. So you need to make sure that you have all of your materials in that regard ready as well. But Kirsty can talk you through the details of all of that. So with that in mind, I'll finish doing the boring bit and I'll hand over to Kirsty, who can take you through the real important parts of what you need to do in order to prepare for this exam. Kirsty.
Thanks, Guy. I'll rely on you to go through the slides. So as Guy said, we train together. So Guy, do chip in with anything. And if anyone has any burning questions they want to ask rather than wait to the end, please drop them in the chat. We can
Sorry, I should have mentioned that at the beginning, Kirsty. Thank you very much. There is a Q&A in here as well that you can use to drop in any questions that you might have. So please feel free.
Great. So I'm going to talk through materials that you need to be familiar with and prepare. Guys kind of covered the format of the exam, so we're not going to touch on that too much. but how to try and best prepare, and then focus on exam technique. That pile of books on the left there is actually what I packed to take to Bristol. So thankfully those days are gone of lugging stuff around the country. You will be able to sit the exam at PC either at home or in the office, which I think is a lot easier. We had people turn up with like pop-up bookcases and all sorts when we were sitting the exams. So there is some choices of materials and how you choose to prepare. This I chose to use Visa. This is a copy of my annotated Visa. I color coded things. I spent forever cutting and pasting the relevant sections of the guidelines into Visa, which I'd blown up so I had margins to stick things in. But your primary material is really up to you. I found this helpful because then I didn't have to go rummaging through the guidelines or the case law looking for different bits. I kind of had everything all in one place. Um, so Visa is one very popular option. It's quite verbose. There's lots of explanation in there. Um, Whereas one of your other options, for example, would be Hookstraw, which I think is a lot more cross-referencing, but not necessarily so much of the explanations. So I would say if you haven't already, take a look at both. Pick which one you want to use as your primary reference material. And then probably once you've made a decision and started annotating, I would say stick with it. Then in addition to the EPC, you also need to be really familiar with the PCT. I used the cross-reference PCT and found that super helpful. I think it's fair to say the PCT is not particularly user-friendly. I think it's in the examiner's comments every year that people need to be more familiar with it. People don't use it as much as people aren't as familiar with it as they are the EPC. But I found this version particularly helpful because it cross-references the applicant's guide, which I think is more user-friendly, but it also cross-references the relevant articles of the EPC as well as the PCT rules and regulations. There are so many other things that you need to be familiar with in addition to just the EPC and the PCT. This is kind of a list, but I wouldn't say it's exhaustive. Obviously, the case law, the guidelines are really crucial. The protocols, like Article 69, and things like the recognition and things that you'll probably never look again at for some time in your career, but they will be tested in Paper D. You'll find some of these things in Visa or also at the back of the standard EPC text. The latest schedule of fees, debit orders, automatic. The Paris Convention, again, there are some relevant bits in Visa. The rules of procedure for the Boards of Appeal, the London Agreement, national law is really important. Say the PCT applicant's guide is super helpful rather than just trying to navigate the PCT. Lists of contracting states, making sure that you pay attention to the dates on those. Lists of international exhibitions for Article 55 EPC, you can find those in the OJ. And then the ancillary regulations, and maybe sometimes if you've done a particular past paper that you're really pleased with an answer or some practice questions, particularly now you don't have to lug all your stuff to the other side of the country. Some of those can be useful to have to hand. But what I would say is that you don't have that much time. So whilst it can be reassuring to have all of these materials, and you definitely need to be aware and familiar of them, you need to be familiar enough with them that you can find what you want quickly, because you don't generally have time to start rummaging through, wondering where bits and pieces are. Some helpful links regarding the exam. Pete Pollard does a really helpful blog. The The yellow sheet had some notes about the EQE when it first moved online. So some of those might be still relevant. Delta Patents also wrote about that and the wise flow system. And Delta Patents have some helpful guidance on D2 as well. So those are some other helpful things that you can take a look at. So in terms of starting your preparation, it depends on what kind of person you are and how you like to work. Personally, I found it really reassuring to have a timeline. And I, in particular, used the Delta Patents Paper D questions. Once I had annotated my VISA, I found those particularly helpful, and I figured out how many days I had between starting revision to the exam, and I kind of allocated, right, this day I'll do priority questions, this day I'll do novelty questions, or whatever it might be, and drew myself up a timetable. Obviously, closer to the exam, you need to fit in some past papers. And you can find the whole compendium on the EPO website, bearing in mind that papers change. So you obviously want to save the most recent ones for closest to the exam. And then you can also sign up for daily paper D questions. And those will appear in your inbox. And you can work through those for 20 minutes, half an hour in the office, whatever it might be. Personally, I found the Delta Patents the most helpful, and the more you did of a particular topic and a particular type of question, the more you realise the same points came up again and again. And I found it useful to make a list of those, so that when I came to doing past papers further down the line, I was like, okay, well, you always get a mark for this and you always get a mark for that in this topic. So that's kind of how I prepared. People have different approaches, but what I would say is when you're making that timetable, bear in mind that paper D does take up the most time of all the papers, but don't leave yourself short of time for doing other practice papers as well, and also time for breaks. So you're going to want some time off over Christmas, for example. Some of you might not really start preparing until near the end of the year if you're doing the UK finals. So there's lots to factor in, but make sure you try and set yourself something that's attainable and not that's just going to stress you out because you've tried to cram too much in. So looking at D1 in particular, like Guy said, you don't really need to write loads down, but the way you answer the question is important. So basically, yes or no, and then what you need to do, and making sure that you always cite the legal basis. And there is a hierarchy for that. So for the EPC, it's articles, rules, decision of the president, case law, and there's an order of the decisions, and then the guidelines. And then for the PCT, the articles, the regulations, the applicant's guide. And not just saying why it's the legal basis, but saying how you then apply it to the situation in the question. Take a look at how many minutes there are per mark and try and divide your time per question. Don't spend ages on something that's only worth a couple of marks. Make sure you read the question carefully. I think that's even more important now that it's on screen and you can't highlight and scribble things. So if you're someone, I don't know, maybe I'm getting old, but I still like working with bits of paper, and that's not so easy to do on this system. So if you want to take notes, then practice how you're doing that and figure out a system and making sure, doubly sure that you copy down, if you're making notes, that you copy everything correctly, particularly when it comes to dates. All of the information in the question tends to be there for a reason. So when you're looking back at your answer, have you used all the information in the question is a really important double check. I think you can't write because enough in this paper, and giving reasons, even if it seems really obvious, and take things a little bit further than you necessarily would in real life. So we might just be used to, for example, saying this is the priority date and giving the date. But in paper D, you need to say this is the priority date because that's the filing date of the priority application, which is the first application within the meaning of Article 87(1) EPC, not just this is the priority date. So you've got to take it that step further, which really comes with practice, because it's not necessarily, you wouldn't necessarily give that level of advice, because a client in everyday life doesn't need to know about Article 87(1) EPC. They just need to know how things affect them. But the examiners want to see you applying the law. If the question is asking you something as well, make sure that you reach a conclusion rather than going, it could be this or it could be that. I think that's quite important. And again, making sure that you say because and applying the law to your reasoning. So some easy things that you get marks for, making sure you use dates in the question. So rather than saying, for example, if there's something to do with an office action that it has a 4-month deadline, don't just say that, give the actual date, how it's calculated, when it expires, what needs doing. Excuse me. If something needs to be filed, think about what needs to be filed, when it needs to be filed, where it needs to be filed. If something needs to be paid, how much does it need to be paid? When does it have to be paid by? How is it paid? Where is it paid? Cross-check your dates. You can lose really easy marks by just missing a date. Look at the day of the week. Would it be an excluded day? Is it an EPO closed day? Don't necessarily calculate fees if they don't ask, but always calculate a time limit. What jurisdiction is the question in? If it refers to practicing before the EPO, you want to be, for your legal basis, quoting the EPC and potentially the PCT. If there's no reference to if it's an EP or a PCT application, quote the Paris Convention for priority. To be fair, it doesn't do any harm to quote the Paris Convention for any priority question. But absolutely, you must do that for a PCT priority question. If it's talking about a few months, then think about renewal fees. Don't just think what's due immediately, but what's coming up further down the line. So the question will give you clues, but particularly dates and fees are quite easy things to gain marks for, and they will come up time and time again. Something that I would put large amounts of money on will always come up is suspected infringement. And here is a list of things to consider. This is also really useful for the UK exams, because again, you get the same kind of marks for things all the time. So if I'm not going to read all of these out, Emmy will have a copy of the slides, but if you suspect infringement, there's a list of things you could look through and suggest. They may not all be relevant, so don't cite things that aren't irrelevant, but things like saying you can't enforce the patent until granted, you will get a mark for that, and that's not rocket science. So take these easy hits. Request early publication, think about provisional protection. Can you request accelerated search prosecution, setting up watches, cross-licensing? But if you're talking about cross-licensing, be specific. Don't just mention it in a vague kind of way. Relate it to the facts of the question. Think PCT, has the regional phase before the EPO been entered? Have fees been paid? Have meetings taken place in confidence? Check agreements? Have licenses, assignments been registered, etc., etc. Is it entitled to priority? Does that change the prior art situation? These kind of things come up time and time again, and the more past papers you do, the more you will see these issues. But it can be really helpful to make a list, and potentially, when you're sitting in the exam, you've got a list of things to do with suspected infringement, and you can rattle some of these points off and get easy marks. But like I say, don't just rattle them off verbatim. Make sure that you do relate them to the facts of the question. Moving on to D2, I think this is even more important to practice than D1. It's a little bit harder. Delta patterns, I think, do D2 questions, but they take a little bit more time, and you can't just go, oh, I've got a spare half an hour, I'll do a couple of D2 questions, like you can with D1. And I think there's a little bit more practice required for D2. I think it's a little bit more difficult to digest the information in the question. So practice doing that and practice how that works for you. Again, if you're taking notes, make sure that you're copying the information down correctly. You don't want to lose marks just because you've copied something incorrectly off the screen. Make sure you look at how you split your time in a way that works for you. When you're going through the question, I would always highlight any questions in the text of the question. They are definitely going to want an answer to that. Make sure you address it. Identify the client's wishes. Even if their wishes are a load of rubbish and they're not attainable, make sure that you address it and you can say yes or no and give your reasoning. Is there anything at the end of the question? Sometimes the date of the client's letter is really important. It's usually important. It's normally the date of the exam, and that will help guide your timeline. So double check that. I would always highlight the dates in a different colour. I think for D2, legal basis isn't as required in D1 as it is for full marks. But if you can, make sure that you put it down and use it for efficiency, or make sure that you at least maybe get the articles in and go back and put the rules in at a later date, if you've got more time towards the end. I think a timeline in D2 is particularly helpful. There's a lot of information in the question to digest. And again, practice how it works for you. There are different ways of digesting that information, taking it down. Do you want to do a table? Do you want to do notes? And we'll have a look at an example in a minute. But things to bear in mind, the date of the exam, check for close days, include today's date. Think about future projections of dates, so priority dates, filing dates, publication grant, the end of the opposition period, time limits for paying fees, opposition, grant will dictate divisional deadlines, any 6-month deadline related to Article 55. And think about how those all link together. There may be something due imminently, or has something just expired, but further processing is available, for example. So I think the big table here is what I used when I was doing D2 back in the day, but that's just one example. So figure out what works for you, but having the effective, the priority dates, filing date, publication, grant, if any of those dates are available to you, then it helps just try and assimilate the information into something that's a little bit more digestible. There's another option on the right, and that's to have everything in date order, and have the applications listed in separate columns. Again, practice what works for you. There's no necessarily right or wrong answer, but practice and be comfortable with how you're using the information in the question before the exam. A little bit like D1, the same issues come up in D2 all the time. I think D2 is even more predictable. There probably will be a priority issue. Is it the same applicant? Less relevant now in view of the new case law. Has it been timely filed? Is it the first application? There will be prior art issues. Make sure that you check the dates and don't use something for 54.2 if it's only 54.3. Look at public disclosures, non-prejudicial disclosures, something that comes up in paper D all the time that you'll probably never see ever again. Think about generic versus specific disclosures. Ways to rescue applications will always come up. Are there extensions available? Is further processing available? Do you need to consider re-establishment? Is there any subject matter that's not been claimed? Can you add those claims in? Do you need a divisional? What about licensing? What needs to be licensed? To who does it need to be licensed? Where? Is there a cross-licensing situation? These are all things that come up time and time again. And again, the more papers you practice, the more you will see these issues, and have potentially lists of common themes and how to address them. I think for D2, there's quite a common format to the answer. There's usually two parties. Your client will be on one side, and then there will be a third party on the other side. So often the core of a D2 answer is, us versus them. What does your client want to do? Where does your client operate? Or what does the third party do? Where do they operate? Who owns what? And then you can say, in summary, the client has the following rights, which cover the activity of the competitor. The competitor has the following rights in the following states. This will prevent the client from doing X, Y, Z, for example. And then once you have that core of your answer, then you can start expanding and start providing specific advice, expanding on each of those points. Which territories, what do they need to do to strengthen their position? Can they accelerate prosecution? Can they amend the application to cover particular subject matter? What can you do to prevent the client? Is the opposition period still open? Can you file third-party observations, etc., etc.? Can you set up watches? Is it better not to take any action for a particular reason? And then something that is quite important to say is also the EPC doesn't provide for infringement. So you could include a statement saying both parties could discuss cross-licensing and they can continue to operate in their respective business areas. But make sure, again, I think one of the frequent examiners' comments is that applicants always, or candidates always say, you should cross-license, but don't expand properly and don't give any details. So just saying, oh, you should cross-license isn't going to get you the marks. You've got to go into the detail about all of these things. And again, if you've got a list of things that need to be considered, like this list here, make sure that you properly apply it to the facts of the question. Otherwise, in D2, you're not going to get the marks. It's less about the legal basis in D2, but making sure that you give the client appropriate advice. Again, like D1, there are easy marks for stating the obvious and the reason. I think we've covered off a lot of these things, but things like saying it's not prior art until it's published. If someone's talking about an application that they've filed, was the meeting in confidence? It's not going to be prior art if it is. So, just bear some of these things in mind, and describe processes carefully. So, for example, for further processing, don't just say the applicant can use further processing. Say, what's the omitted act that they need to complete? When is the date that it needs to be done by? What is the fee? So it's, again, you might feel like you know all of these things, but you're not going to get the marks for them unless you specifically write them down. So I think that was pretty much all I had to say on those points. So I'll hand back to Guy.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for that, Kirsty. Those are unbelievably important and well-grounded pieces of advice that will put you in a good position, whether you've just started preparing for the exams or whether you're already on your journey. Don't forget any of those as you prepare. Thank you very much for a couple of questions that have popped up in the Q&A so far. So will the presentation be made available? Allah, thank you. And Ali Razor, thank you. Could you let us know how we can access the recordings? So yes, presentations and recordings will be made available. We'll put them on, we'll host them on the EQE training website under the free resources page, and I'll post onto LinkedIn when they're available. I just, in terms of logistics, we'll probably close off this seminar series with our session on foundation paper on Wednesday this week, and then I'll upload everything all at once before the end of the week. Fingers crossed. Thank you for the further question. I think, Kirsty, this might be one for you. Regarding the hierarchy of the legal texts, decisions of the EPO president are more important than decisions of the boards of appeal. Is that correct? Decisions, which takes precedence? Decisions of the EPO president or decisions of the boards of appeal?
I recall from when we were sitting the exams that it was decisions of the president.
Yeah.
Do you concur?
I concur. Yes, yes.
Yeah, yes. So I think that is the order.
Brilliant. Thank you for your question. Wonderful. So that's all the interesting bits. So I will just wrap up now with some resources. So these sessions are hosted by EQE Training, but we don't train for paper D, and we only do papers A and B, and we'll do foundation next year, most likely. So for those of you that want to seek sort of training advice, Kirsty mentioned Delta Patents. They're a really good resource. And also Sophia Pintz at Fillin have very highly recommended training courses and preparation courses for paper D. But you've also got the standard SAPI and the European Patent Office and API as well. So any of these will be very good resources for you to look towards. And then you've got the applicant's guide, sorry, not the applicant's guide, the study guide for EQE candidates that's been published, and there's a link to that on our LinkedIn feed as well if you want to take a look at that. But all of these come recommended. Kirsty and myself, we studied with SAP, but that was back in the day, and there's more training available now. Right. Well, with that, I'll wrap up. I'll talk a little bit longer. So if you have any further questions, then drop them into the Q&A. But just to sort of wind down from what you've heard today. So first of all, hopefully you recognize that paper D is the most complex exam that you're going to sit. That doesn't mean the other ones are easy. They're all very difficult exams, and that's why we run these courses, to make sure everybody's as well prepared as they can be, or at least embarks on their journey of preparation as well prepared as they can be. But at the same time, don't feel overwhelmed, because these exams are designed for you to be able to pass them and demonstrate your competence. You just need to be very well prepared for them. So the simple fact that you're on this call today, or catching up on the recording if you're catching up later, sets you apart from other candidates. So recognize that and be happy that that's the case. At the same time, don't be complacent either. It's July. The exams take place in March. Summer's coming, Christmas is between the two, the festive break, has impacts on your time and preparation. So make sure you do what Kirsty said, work out where you are today, when the exams are, and fill that time up in between with all the preparations that you need. In particular, for paper D, understand the syllabus. If it tells you that you need to know the EPC, take a look at the contents of the EPC, take a look at the contents of the PCT, break it down into sections, break those sections down into further details, and set it against the time that you have available. And make sure, absolutely, you fold in all of the past papers you possibly can. In that regard, over excessive preparation is going to be your secret weapon, especially for this paper. And those past papers are your friends. You need to take the opportunity to do proper exam questions under proper exam conditions. You've got the Delta Patents books, you've got the kind of coffee time D1 questions, but you also need to practice using the papers in the structure that they'll be given to you, and try and use them within the WiseFlow system. Mocks will be made available, or create a quasi WiseFlow system by doing them on your computer with your materials around you as necessary. But make sure you do that, because you must develop that muscle of being able to do the exams under exam conditions. Build up to it, but definitely make sure that's part of the last third or a quarter of your exam preparations. There is huge value in doing past papers, but you will be doing yourself a great disservice if you do not then go into the examiner's comments and look at how the marks are allocated. Because whatever you do, no matter how good you are, you won't get it perfect. And the examiner's comments will allow you to see where the marks were allocated and where you might have lost marks, missed out on marks. That process is very important, and you'll learn from it, and you can constantly add that information into your materials, your revision materials, or your actual template materials for the exam to make sure that you fill those, you strengthen those weaknesses as you go through. It's all a huge amount of work. As I said at the start, don't feel overwhelmed. The other thing that I've said at the end of every session is you need to be kind to yourself. It is a tough situation that you'll find yourself in between now and the exams. You're going to have to work hard, but you're going to have to treat yourself well during that time. So look after yourself, sleep and exercise and eat properly and all the things that you would normally do. We have our little EQE logo at the bottom, and it's a podium. And we always say to our candidates, you want to imagine yourself stood on that podium having won the EQEs because of all the efforts that you've put in. And there's like a running track around the outside to denote the training. But it is that, you're going to have to really put the effort in. But that investment and those efforts will be worth it. Your 2025 efforts in the exam will matter. Hopefully, they'll matter because you pass the exams that you sit. If you're sitting A, B, C, or D, even if you don't pass, hope you do, but even if you don't, you get the opportunity to resit them again in 2026. And even if that doesn't work out for you, and I'm sure it will, fingers crossed, then you'll be able to take forward some, hopefully, the exemptions from these old exams into the new exams, and they map onto the M papers as necessary. But as I say, well done for being here today. Well done for embarking on your journey or making us part of your journey for preparing for those exams. I'll wrap up there just to say that this concludes our seminar series on the papers. As you can see, we had seminar 2, 3, 4, A and B, C, and then today with paper D. Highly unlikely that anybody listening to the paper D session will need to have the seminar 5 on the foundation exam. But if you've got any colleagues, friends, people in your network who are preparing for the foundation exam, please do point them towards seminar number 5, which will take place on Wednesday with another of Kirsty's colleague, Catherine, and we'll be updating you on what's anybody joining us on what's necessary for that foundation exam. And thank you very much for your question in the Q&A. That's another one come through. How do you recommend using weekly self-assembled study group, discussing topics, answering questions in plenum, or something different? If you can do it, I highly recommend it. So speaking personally, I'm not a great self-starter when it comes to these sorts of exams. I find them a little bit intimidating. So having a group of like-minded individuals driving me forwards was unbelievably important. And Kirsty was indeed one of those individuals. And look at us now, years on, we're still, remembering the experiences and working together to help you guys out as well. So thank you for the question. I recommend doing it. Quite how that works depends on your own personal situations, but I do understand that there are Telegraph groups or LinkedIn groups and so on that allow you to connect with other people sitting the exam. So definitely use those resources as well if you don't already have them within your own sort of network of training.
I agree with Guy. I think they can be super helpful. I would just place one caveat on there, and certainly something I found when I was sitting the exams, when you had for example, the Delta Patents questions, and there's forums, and take some people on there with a pinch of salt, I would say. I think there will always be people who are trying to show that they know everything, and that isn't necessarily always helpful and can sometimes be a bit intimidating. Remember, you're running your own race. So also, if you feel that people are way ahead of you in preparation, some people might be, some people will also be far behind you. So I worry about yourself rather than what everybody else seems to know, because I think that can sometimes be a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, definitely. It's good advice. Thank you. And thank you very much for the question. Okay, so I'll wrap up now. for those of you that asked the questions about the availability of the materials, thank you again for that question. And we will be making them available on EQE training. And just follow us on LinkedIn, and I'll post when those materials are available. But for now, we'll conclude. Thank you all very much for joining, and massive thanks to Kirsty for taking part in this session and for sharing all of that experience and knowledge. We hope you found it useful. If you need anything, you can reach out to us, not me, via LinkedIn. You can find Kirsty on LinkedIn as well. But good luck with your preparations. We hope this has been useful, and please take care of yourselves. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, everyone.